on college campuses and actually inciting harm towards Jewish students.
It was shocking to see that hundreds of students that I knew in my classes were spreading misinformation that BDS failed because the Jewish community had way more money than the people who support BDS, who have to work and can't afford to go vote.
There is a very thin line between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism today. When you import the conflict by turning against the Jews and make every Jew responsible for events in the Middle East, which becomes a form of anti-Semitism.
Back to the oven! You need a big oven, that's what you need!
What happens in the boys' locker room stays there.
All the red lines have been crossed. And as anti-Semitism is not condemned when it is expressed, you have all these anti-Semitism that are today a free-to-go path. You have BDS on campus. You also have demonstrations where they call on killing the Jews. You also have demonstrations going far beyond insults or threats. It's really something that tries to work on the subconscious and make the Jew the guilty person.
That's really the fear. If you're scared of being Jewish in public, scared of living a Jewish life, I mean, not only are you letting the people who hate us win, we're really abandoning our culture that we followed for thousands of years.
Even if we cannot totally stop it, I want to be this voice that will say, no, this cannot happen. I want to do it, not for me, but for my children, as a grandmother, for my grandchildren, my granddaughters. I think it's important to fight this fight. And I'm going to walk this walk until I cannot do it anymore, and hope that there will be other people that will come forward and continue this fight.
As you heard my grandfather say, he lived it, he survived it, and he witnessed the dangers of anti-Semitism. Educate yourself, speak out, and use your voice.
Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. These are the words spoken by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in 1957. He was speaking at a time of heightened assaults against the Black community and its institutions. The symbol of darkness for humankind's inhumane treatment of one another appears in Jewish tradition as well. In the Exodus story, we're told that the plague of darkness that befell Egypt when Pharaoh refused to free the Israelite slaves was so thick that the Egyptians could not see one another. Our sages liken that real darkness to the symbolic darkness that prevented Egyptian taskmasters from seeing the suffering of their fellow human beings. Today, it often feels like we're submerged in that same darkness. When people are harassed and harmed in our streets, gunned down in places like Charleston, South Carolina, Pittsburgh, Poway, Christchurch, New Zealand, Oak Creek, Wisconsin, El Paso, Buffalo, and Laguna Woods. When houses of worship are vandalized, when extremists are emboldened and hateful rhetoric is part of the public discourse, when all of this happens, darkness prevails over light. Dr. King's words beseech us to search for light within ourselves and to spread that light so that each of us can be an agent for driving out darkness. And so today we're here, a community of leaders and stakeholders, to spread that light and to be those agents. We know too well the stories of darkness and countless others, the stories that are the humanity behind the data on the alarming spike of hate crimes and hate incidents in recent years, acts of hate targeting Jews and other communities locally, nationally, and globally. Meanwhile, our democratic institutions are being threatened in ways we have not seen since the American Civil War. And none of this is coincidental. It's a pattern we've seen throughout history. In 1939, as Germany solidified restrictions on the civil and human rights of its Jewish citizens and began its assault on Europe, and in reaction to Father Charles Coughlin's anti-Semitic rhetoric that flowed from the radios into the homes of millions of Americans, 3 Harvard University faculty members warned of the dangers that begin with anti-Semitism. They saw how attacks on Jews were fueling attacks on others and on our democratic principles. In a pamphlet that the university circulated widely, they wrote, "We oppose anti-Semitism not only because it's false and unfair, but because anti-Semitism and democracy cannot live side by side." The late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs echoed this warning in his 2016 address to the European Parliament when he said, "The appearance of anti-Semitism in a culture is the first symptom of a disease, the early warning sign of a collective breakdown. The hate that begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews. No society that has sustained anti-Semitism has ever sustained liberty or human rights or religious freedom. For the sake of our society, it is incumbent upon us to understand these ideas and to heed these warnings." And so today we endeavor to do just that, with the guidance of renowned experts who come to us with a wealth of knowledge and experience and who bring nuanced perspectives to critical conversations about anti-Semitism in its complex nature. Together, we will unpack the ways that anti-Semitism threatens all of us and gain tools, resources, and wisdom to help us forge a way forward. As you engage with abundant new ideas and information, you'll be exposed to viewpoints that are both familiar to you and different from your own. You may be challenged by some of what you hear. The question is, what will you do when you're challenged? Our hope is that you will lean in, listen with empathy, and with the intention to understand so that together we can drive out darkness. Before we begin the learning, there's a few quick thanks I want to offer. Actually, a lot of thanks, but I'm going to do it quickly. Thank you to our Summit Steering Committee, Rabbi Peter Levy, Rabbi Rick Steinberg, Dr. Matthias Lehman, and Ida Kelly, and to the presenting organizational partners, the ADL of Orange County Long Beach, Congregation Shir HaMa'alot, and UC Irvine Center for Jewish Studies. Thank you to Jewish Federation and the Rose Project for allowing us the space to create this, and to my incredible team and our volunteers for making this day run smoothly. UC Irvine is a most fitting setting for today's summit, and I want to express my gratitude on behalf of Jewish Federation to the university for our long-standing partnership, one that's rooted in our collective efforts to raise awareness of and combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. Thank you to our host, UCI's Office of Inclusive Excellence, under the leadership of Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Dr. Douglas Haynes. And thank you all for being here, and to our many ally partners for your support. I wish you a most successful day of learning. And it is now my honor to invite to the stage Dr. Howard Gilman, the 6th Chancellor of the University of California, Irvine.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for everything you do as well. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to UCI. We are delighted and honored to support this extraordinary gathering in service of our community and indeed in service, I think, of the nation as a whole. Some of you may know that the great motto of the University of California is Fiat Lux, let there be light. And we are gathered to bring the light that will drive out the darkness of ignorance, the darkness of intolerance. We may be talking about dark things today, but this room is a room of joy and optimism and determination to move our community more toward the light. Almost exactly 5 years ago, we witnessed a crowd of people marching through Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Some might have hoped that the Unite the Right rally would be an aberration highlighting the views of fringe extremists. If only. Instead, it was a harbinger. And the blood and soil radicals have, if anything, been emboldened and in no small measure welcomed into the mainstream of politics, both in the United States and abroad. In just this past primary election season, there were candidates for public office who openly proclaimed their hatred for Jews. The Republican nominee for Arizona governor recently endorsed an Oklahoma legislative candidate who has said, "The Jews are evidence that evil exists." Kim Crockett, the Republican nominee for Secretary of State of Minnesota, described George Soros as a puppet master of her Jewish opponent. And the problems don't just come from the right. We have also seen attacks from the far left, not just in Jeremy Corbyn's British Labour Party, but among others who claim that Jews should be perceived as white and privileged and powerful and oppressive, rather than as persistent victims of one of the oldest, if not the oldest, hatred. It is no surprise that the Anti-Defamation League found that anti-Semitic incidents in the United States hit a record high in 2021, nearly triple the number of incidents compared just to 2015. Vandalism is on the rise, harassment is on the rise, assaults against Jews increased by 167%, Jews being beaten in broad daylight in the middle of Times Square or Los Angeles or the Las Vegas Strip. We at UCI are not insulated from these issues. We never have been. In fact, during UCI's planning stages in the 1960s, UC President Clark Kerr had to work hard to force an end to restrictive real estate covenants in this area. Many of you recall how 15 years ago in 2007, UC Irvine was in the news because of hate speech and hateful incidents that profoundly affected all of us, but especially our Jewish students, colleagues, friends, and neighbors. Since then, we, and by we I mean faculty, staff, and students together, along with community partners, have worked very hard to speak explicitly about the scourge of anti-Semitism and to ensure that our Jewish students feel as if UCI is a place where they are welcome and where they can thrive. As one example, after the regents of the University of California denounced both anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism, we were the first UC campus to systematically assess how best to implement the regent's statement, and the resulting Higher Ground report provided over 19 separate recommendations to combating anti-Semitism, ensuring campus accountability, promoting education and training, and commitment to responsive engagement with our community. Among our activities were a series of events on anti-Semitism, including on the topic of anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism, featuring New York Times columnist Bret Stephens, and I know a good number of you attended this important community event. I'm not saying things are perfect, but as I said, we are not insulated from the larger world, but the work we are doing today means that we can all stand together and address these issues with a clear voice. Most recently, by the way, we have expanded our initiatives to support our work in Jewish studies. Through the efforts of our Center for Jewish Studies, we're working to establish a unique, new endowed chair dedicated to the study of anti-Semitism and a second chair in Israel Studies. These are not just resources for the benefit of the university. At a great public research university, the expertise and capacity of faculty members serves our broader community. And this community deserves world-class experts on these issues, and we're committed with your partnership to making sure that both our academic community and broader community can benefit from that expertise. In addition, we're forging new partnerships with the School of Jewish Studies at Tel Aviv University and partnering with regional K-12 schools to provide training and curricular materials to teachers. You may have seen the exciting announcement that Doctors Susan and Henry Samueli, good friends to many in this room, have generously supported our initiatives with a $4 million match for any additional giving toward UCI's Jewish Studies goals. We are incredibly grateful for their partnership, and we're eager to enhance our partnerships with all of you and all people in our region of goodwill who cares deeply about these issues. In reporting on the unprecedented rise of anti-Semitism, the ADL's Jonathan Greenblatt has said that this isn't really a Jewish problem, it's an American problem. It is a Europe problem. And history has shown time and time again, as we have heard, that the scapegoating and targeting of Jews is just a canary in the coal mine for much broader threats and dangers, especially against efforts to create truly inclusive democracies. And so it is an act of great patriotism for us to gather, acknowledge the issue, engage in dialogue, educate ourselves, create new partnerships, develop strategies, and leverage our collective goodwill and our collective resources. This is a summit, and so let's reach new heights of insight and effective action. I thank all of you for being here. I thank all of our great partners at the Jewish Federation of Orange County and the Rose Project, at the ADL, at UCI's own Center for Jewish Studies, at Congregation Shir Hamalot, and every educational, civic, political, and religious institution and organization in our region who is with us today. I thank all of our wonderful speakers and facilitators. Fiat lux, Yehi or, let there be light. Thank you so much.
Please welcome to the stage Jewish Federation of Orange County's Board Chair, Heather Klein.
Good morning. Let me just organize the height situation. Good morning. My name is Heather Klein, and I am incredibly proud to serve as the board chair of the Jewish Federation of Orange County. I cannot express just how inspiring and encouraging it is to be here with all of you today on this campus and in this setting. For many of us, we are meeting for the very first time, yet we are united in our varied work to keep Orange County thriving and safe. We are all here because we share a deep concern over the climate for hate in our community, and because we recognize that it is time for us to act. Time for us to act in the spaces where we live and work, and collectively as an Orange County community to build a better future for the next generation. In case you are not familiar with the work of Jewish Federation, this summit is a perfect example of what we do best. Jewish Federation convenes and engages the Orange County Jewish community, providing strategic philanthropy, communal leadership, through grants and programs that enhance Jewish life and assist people in need. And this summit demonstrates Federation also mobilizes community, all of you, on collective issues of concern. At this moment of deepening polarization in our country, when it often feels like discourse on critical issues is becoming more and more fraught, Jewish Federation, through its Rose Project, has found a way to bring us together for this important day-long conversation. We know that anti-Semitism is not the only type of hate that is on the rise in this country or in this county. Even as we explore the relationship between anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, we know that not all hate is inspired by anti-Semitism. And we know that our diverse communities carry with them their own unique stories and experiences of hate and intolerance, both historically and currently. My hope is that the Jewish Federation, in partnership with all of you, begins to write a new story rooted in hope for a better future. On behalf of the Board of Directors and professionals of the Jewish Federation of Orange County, I welcome further conversation about these or any other partnership opportunities. And now it is my privilege to introduce our first two keynote speakers. You will find the full, illustrious, and robust bios of all of our speakers in our summit webpage, which you can access through the QR code in your printed program. As such, we will dispense with the long introductions and get on with it. Suffice it to say that our two opening speakers, Eric Ward and Oren Siegel, are national experts on the manifestations of anti-Semitism and hate and the threats that they pose to civil society. We are extremely fortunate to have both of them here with us today on stage, where they will engage in conversation about the prevalence of anti-Semitism in the framework of discourse from all sides of the political spectrum, a critical first step in our efforts to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. Thank you.
Eric, what do you want to talk about? Good to see you.
It's very good to see you.
I'll just say I'm struck by discussions of anti-Semitism. I mean, you saw in the video and the great opening statements that we heard. We're talking about really, really dark topics, hence the name of this conference. And yet I will tell you, in doing this work for 20 years, I've never been part of a discussion looking at some of the worst manifestations of anti-Semitism without the conversation actually being hopeful. Yeah. It's kind of like, all right, this is happening, what are we going to do about it? And so this is why I'm so excited to talk to you, Eric, as somebody who's been doing something about it in different ways, in different communities for so long. I feel like I have a bunch of questions for you.
Fair.
And I hope that we can help essentially set the table for what so many of you are going to hear throughout the day on these incredible panels. So the first question I have for you, Eric, why are we even doing this? Like, why is the issue of anti-Semitism leading almost every newscast? It's on the front of every paper. Why are so many manifestations of anti-Semitism popping up today?
Yeah. It's great to see you, and I was listening to like expert introduction. I just want to be clear, right? Oren is the expert, I'm the pundit, right? Up here, but it is true, right, that we are looking at a historic level of anti-Semitism in the modern age, and there is a reason, right? And in some ways, it's unavoidable, right? Anti-Semitism has always been tapped into, right, in order to build political movements, particularly in populist moments. And we'll get a little chance to talk about this. But the world, how's everyone doing, by the way? Everyone's got coffee, right? It's great to see everyone. I'm from Long Beach, right? So I grew up in Long Beach, just a little bit up the road. If there's anyone else from the LBC, and then I got to get a little love before I jump into anti-Semitism, because I saw one of my favorite concerts here at UC Irvine when I was a young kid, general public. And we're going to be talking about music. We're going to be talking about culture, right? We're going to be talking about politics and the influence that anti-Semitism is having on these things, but again, very hopeful. So why are we facing this moment of anti-Semitism? I think we're facing it because the world is going through great stresses right now in the world, and has been for a long time. The first one, or in being demographic anxiety, right? The shift of demographics, not only in the United States, but around the world because of migration, sometimes forced migration, because of economic pressures. And the demographic anxiety, right? The shifting demographics of a community, studies have shown prove and create anxiety, right? Now, anxiety isn't a bad thing. All of us have anxiety. When I walked into this room today and saw all of these amazing folks in the room, right, I immediately felt, right, a little bit of anxiety walking into a space of people that I don't know, right, in the rules. Well, this happens on a large macro level, right, each and every day. And we can talk about how that plays out in the United States, but it's playing out all over the world. That anxiety, right, usually we learn how to manage it, kind of like flying a plane, right? Or, I don't know, if people have a fear of flying. But if you have a fear of flying, one of the things, right, that a coach or therapist will tell you, right, that the answer to managing the fear of flying is to fly more, right? To fly as many times as you can. And the next thing they will tell you is that you'll never overcome your fear of flying. what you'll learn how to do is to manage the anxiety of flying. In the same way, we're going through this huge demographic change. We're having this anxiety that we need to manage as a country, as a world, right? But we have folks telling us two things that aren't particularly helpful right now. On one side, right, we have groupings of political folks tapping in, right, to this anxiety and telling us that it's an existential threat, right? That, and we heard this on the streets of Charlottesville, right? At first the chant was, "You won't replace me." Then it became, "Jews won't replace me." The media spent hours and hours dissecting, right? Was it Jews won't replace us or you won't replace us? But the underlying article was both were anti-Semitic statements, right? Both were promoting the replacement theory, this idea that Jews, right, are behind demographic change in the United States, right, as a plot to destroy white America. The replacement theory is an anti-Semitic threat. We are seeing that narrative play out in American society, and people are tapping into it. So that's one source of anti-Semitism in the United States and globally as well. Why should all of us be concerned about that? Because we are all victims of anti-Semitism. All of our communities have experienced the violence of anti-Semitism. We're most familiar, of course, with the tragic and horrific actions of the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, right? But we're less familiar with the anti-Semitic underpinnings of the murderer who walked into an El Paso Walmart and opened fire, killing Latinos. Or a young man, right, driven by anti-Semitism who walked into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, killing black worshipers. Or an individual who walked into a Sikh house of worship in Wisconsin, right, killing people. In each of these cases, I'm not saying, right, that other forms of bigotry weren't at play, but the unique nature of anti-Semitism was the underpinning motivation in each of those cases. So I'm concerned because anti-Semitism isn't just a threat to the Jewish community. It's a threat to all of us, and it's being politicized to undercut democracy in America. That's just one form of anti-Semitism, though, right? There's anti-Semitism out of the left that may not be biologically based, but it breeds and taps into the generalized anti-Semitism that exists in American society. Neither the left or right, brings anti-Semitism into our communities. They merely tap into the anti-Semitism that already exists. And so while we may not be able to do a lot about anti-Semitism on the left and right now, except to point it out, there is lots that we can do in our own communities, right, to inoculate ourselves from those who seek to manipulate anti-Semitism in America.
So I want to underscore one specific point that you made about how anti-Semitism impacts other communities, and also, you know, as somebody who works with a team that is spending almost every waking hour in the online spaces where a lot of these hateful narratives are incubated, are spread, and animate real-world violence. That's what we do at the ADL Center on Extremism. It always strikes me the degree to which every narrative can have like an anti-Semitic spin, yes, right? And so you mentioned the Pittsburgh shooting, something that I think not a lot of people understand. They know 11 people died or killed at a synagogue by white supremacists. They don't know that one of the primary issues that this individual was animated by was this great replacement theory, but the fear that immigrants were coming into this country, the browning of America, there would be no more white people, and ultimately the Jews were responsible. But here's somebody that in their online social media posts were focusing so much on anti-immigrant sentiment, and at the end of the day, you know, ended up targeting the Jewish community. And in Buffalo, more recently, here's somebody that was clearly animated by anti-Semitic ideas and ended up targeting the African-American community in Buffalo at a grocery store because, you know, he felt that that was a more convenient, easier target. One other example, some of you may have heard of the hostage taking in Colleyville. This was in the beginning of this year. That's interesting. This is somebody who was an Al-Qaeda supporter, and essentially part of the anti-Semitism was I'm going to take hostage Jews in a synagogue, because Jews control this country and will able to free the person that I want freed. Right? So it was almost like a compliment. You guys are so powerful, which is obviously also a conspiracy, but that's why they targeted the Jewish community. And so I don't know if we answer the question why, but it does underscore the need to combat other forms of hate. So let me sort of get back to a question for you. Part of ADL's mission is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice for all. We recognize that the only way that you fight anti-Semitism is fighting other forms of hate, misogyny, Islamophobia, so on and so forth. And the only way to fight those hatreds is to fight anti-Semitism. Can you talk a little bit about now why, in particular, allyship is important, and what can it actually look like?
Yeah. So allyship coming together is very important. We realized this working with the Anti-Defamation League, right? Way back in the early 90s, late 80s in Portland, Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest, right? Much of what the country is experiencing was experienced in the Pacific Northwest and the Mountain West in the 80s. A rise of hate groups who were taking over local communities using fear and intimidation, right? Attacking civil society, attacking law enforcement, attacking elected officials, right? Intimidating minority communities. And we realized early on, right? And I often think it was interesting, Oren, you know this, right? These tables were super complicated, right? You could see a blue-haired, not me, purple punk rocker, right, with a mohawk, sitting next to a Republican rancher. Now, they didn't have everything, they didn't have much in common, let's be clear. But we all
like my Thanksgiving table, by the way.
Right? It's like Thanksgiving dinner, right? And many of the conversations were like sitting around the table, right, at the holidays. Super complicated, right? Lots of conflict, but also lots of curiosity. Look, why it's important is it doesn't mean we agree on everything, but we understand bigotry and hatred, right, don't have a place in how we decide complex problems and solutions in our society. Quite simply, it's about adulting, right? And the thing we have to understand is anti-Semitism is like the opposite of adulting, and I don't mean to minimize anti-Semitism in this way. But if anti-Semitism didn't exist in the world, right, it would have to be invented right now. Because anti-Semitism provides simple answers, right, to complex issues by stereotyping and using tropes, right, against a community. So look, here's why it's important. It's important because we need to understand what is happening in our society. We need to understand when we hear anti-Semitic or other bigoted, right, dog whistles in our society, when we're being manipulated by anxiety and fear. And that doesn't happen unless we're all in the room together. That's the important piece. The other piece I just want to say, right, as a non-Jew, right, as a racial justice activist, right, I am, when you all talk about liberal America, right, that's me, right? When you talk about progressive America, that's me. When you talk about racial justice, right, I am that person. I don't hide, right, my own understandings of the world. But my understandings of the world are value add, not domination. And right now we have people in society, right, who have decided that their ideologies must dominate how everyone understands and sees the world, whether it's healthy or not. And anti-Semitism provides that tool, right? It says, right, that all of these things are happening because of a conspiracy, right? And if we just understand the conspiracy, that will be enough to solve the problems by blaming one group for everything. And so Jews are made to carry, right, the burden of every anxiety in American society. Blame for weather change. You know this. The ADL tracks these things on the daily case. Blame for immigration, right? Blamed, I can show you images, right, where the Jewish community is blamed for ISIS, right? It doesn't matter. Anti-Semitism creates an easy catch-all. And until we close that space, people will tend to use it to organize. Let's be clear, I'm an organizer too. I should have said that from the very beginning, right? A good one too, by the way. But I will say this, as an organizer, right? When I'm based in a community, organizing a community, I don't organize a community around something that they don't already believe, right? Something that they already have energy around. And the fact that so many social movements are tapping into anti-Semitism, and you should talk about like the diversity of folks who are tapping into anti-Semitism. The fact that they are tapping into it means that they realize that there's traction. And so we have to come together, and the way that we're seeing this diversity of attacks on the Jewish community utilizing anti-Semitism, we need a diversity of responses, and that just doesn't happen if we don't get into the room together. And that's the hardest step.
So I wanna dig a little deeper in that. I mean, how do you have a conversation with somebody who says, you know, I'm against anti-Semitism, and we see this on college campuses and elsewhere. But you know, if this person is pro-Israel, I really don't want them to be part of my, you know, social justice issue. That just merely the fact that whether somebody actually supports Israel or not actually is not often relevant. The fact that somebody is perceived to support Israel simply because they're Jewish, for some on the left, means that they are suspect, you know, because they have issues with the, you know, policies of the Israeli government, etc. But we are seeing that increasingly play out, where there's a certain baggage attached to individuals, Jewish individuals in the social justice space, because of the assumptions that are made about their politics vis-a-vis Israel. So when you sit, and you are a good organizer, so I'm going to ask you this, like, when you sit with somebody who might say to you, I'm not sure, you know, we're going to lose credibility if we're working with somebody who's pro-Israel, how do you say, well, how do you address that? How do you make them look past an issue that they are often creating out of thin air?
Yeah. The hardest part, so as an organizer and as a trainer, one of the things that we tell folks, right, is you actually can't counter racism without experiencing racism, right? It's one of the hardest things to hold. One can't challenge anti-Semitism without experiencing anti-Semitism. We've learned, I'm sure there are folks who are experts in brain science and in the mind out here. They can tell you, right, that unconscious, right, so bias resides in the unconscious part of the brain primarily, right, and it comes out under stress, right? Why do people say bigoted and hateful things, right, when they're stressed?
Because of the pandemic.
The pandemic, right? Unconscious mind, right, is quite powerful. And so you have to enter a conversation, and look, there are limits, right? But I don't think we've drawn good spaces, right, around the conversation around anti-Semitism. And we have to have space where we can approach this conversation with curiosity. When someone says to me that they're opposed to anti-Semitism, right, my initial response, if they're a close colleague, is, how would you know? You have never spent time in a training on anti-Semitism. You've never read about the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, right? You've spent no time, right, understanding the dynamics and the tropes and the stereotypes of anti-Semitism. How do you know that you're against anti-Semitism? So the first step in entering a conversation is to kind of explore with curiosity why a person believes what they believe, right? Giving a chance to unpack that and to try to probe with questions. But what you're really trying to get folks to, right? And I'm going to talk particularly on the left, right, where I sit in the racial justice movement, is we have to be better on anti-Semitism. There's no excuse not to understand the fundamentals of anti-Semitism. It is having a huge impact, right, on our communities, right, and on the things that we find important in this moment. And so what I would say is you approach with curiosity, not conflict. You approach with questions, right, and you try to get people into dialogue, right, rather than conflict. And that's super important amongst organizational leaders and civil society. Look, at the end of the day, right, I would just say this, Oren, you know this. Anti-Semitism has come back in the United States largely, right, built off of two issues. One is actually the success of the 1960 civil rights movement, believe that, right? So you have African Americans who advance, right, successfully, right, a successful challenge to Jim Crow and segregation in America. Now imagine for a second, right, you are an arch segregationist. You've been raised and socialized all your life to see black people and other people of color as less than human. How do you come to terms, right, with the fact that you just suffered a huge loss, right, defensive inequality, by the way, right, to folks you see as inferior? Do you all of a sudden just switch, your brain over and say, well, I guess black people aren't inferior after all? That's not what happened. Anti-Semitism then became the explainer for folks of how black folks were able to achieve civil rights. And anti-Semitism then became the explainer, right, for every other gain of civil rights in this society. And that's why you see, sadly, elected officials, right, utilizing this rhetoric today. They know, right, that it fuels this type of anxiety. But on the social justice side, right, the hard conversation is around Israel and Palestine, right? And under the stress of that conversation, right, anti-Semitism bubbles up. And as human rights activists, right, the onus is on us to do a better job understanding anti-Semitism. If we want to have hard conversations, we have to prepare so that bigotry doesn't find its way in there. And we do that, right, by doing our own work. And then for those of us who are trainers, who are concerned about opening up the space to counter anti-Semitism, we can't treat every anti-Semitic statement as if it's coming out of the mouth of David Duke or Louis Farrakhan, right? We haven't had serious conversations outside of the Anti-Defamation League. Look, I want to be clear. We haven't had serious conversations around anti-Semitism in the United States for nearly 20 years. And we're expecting that everyone is suddenly an expert. And that's not simply the case. And that's why trainings like this, right, academic studies become so important, and community training and education as well.
There's two other elements of this sort of rise in anti-Semitism. One is, the denial of anti-Semitism. So when you point out, the data that we're seeing record high numbers of anti-Semitic incidents reported to ADL, the FBI hate crime data shows, similar rises that Jewish community, even though being among the smallest, is always at the top of the list in terms of those that are targeted. Hi, I remember you. And then, so in addition to denial, there's also the inability, to your point, to even recognize anti-Semitism. You were saying, how do we train people when, 20 years it hasn't necessarily been a conversation? To me, that's the scariest part, is that people don't even know how to recognize it, whether it's on their social media feeds, whether it is from the mouths of our, politicians or public speakers, et cetera, the inability to understand these tropes. And so I do think that it's super important to then not like sit through, 10 classes of history, but there has to be a way for people to get better and up to speed at the history of anti-Semitism and what it looks like, because that way you'll understand how it, like the modern manifestations of it. During the pandemic, there were all these conspiracies that the Jews were responsible for this pandemic because they were going to make money off of a vaccine, or because Jews themselves are, trying to capitalize off of, chaos and societal, society running amok. And yet at the same time, we also saw, as we were all on Zoom, for example, or our various platforms, that anti-Semites found a way to leverage new technologies in order to bring anti-Semitism into our own homes. So there's always this balance between, old tropes, but really modern tactics of disseminating that. And I think if we understand what anti-Semitism and those basic tropes are, we understand how hatred writ large is disseminated, we are going to find those spots where we can actually mitigate anti-Semitism in a different way. And so to you, I mean, have you seen the way anti-Semitism, those old sort of age-old tropes are finding modern manifestations?
Yeah, we see these happening all the time now, right? So we saw in the midst of COVID, right? So the stressor of COVID, we saw flyers being spread around the country, particularly in Black and Latino communities, right? That were telling folks, don't go to the Jewish hospital, right? Jewish doctors will infect you, right, with COVID, right? Now, who was spreading those flyers? Who knows, right? But they were being spread because folks felt it would resonate, right, inside of the community. So we see it there. It was just, I'm getting my weeks confused, but I think it was over the last couple of days, right, that I saw something online, right, where an individual was making fun of an elected official whose last name was Goldman, right, and using that, right, that's an anti-Semitic trope. They were turning his last name, right, into this trope. And we see it all the time, Oren, right? Record levels of examples of anti-Semitism. We could list them out literally for the next hour.
So do you feel that the more people are familiar with the way these tropes have played out in the past would impact the way that they try to be mindful of using those tropes in the present, right? So this is kind of the question also with public officials that we're seeing. I agree with you that there are times where people say things, maybe they didn't understand how that would land on a community,
that's
right? But it is the way to sort of make people more mindful of what they're saying, not just against, the Jewish community, but other communities, is to sort of give a history. And then the question is, who has time for that? Like, what is the best way to actually, teach people how to do that? We all have jobs, everybody has families. Like, when do you sort of carve out time to be, to have the skin in the game, if you will? And so this is back to you. Like, how should people carve out time to be anti-racist?
Yeah. So there's three things, and we didn't even get into anti-Semitism as a form of racism, right? There are different constructions of anti-Semitism, and one of the forms of anti-Semitism, right, places Jews as a racialized other, and that's kind of the area that I spend my time trying to tackle. Here's things that I think we should do or should be thinking about doing. So one is we should be practicing having hard conversations, right? That they're actually with compassion with our friends, right? Look, I have a diverse set of friends in this world, and some of my friends say racist things, right? They don't mean to. Right? They're not trying to make my day worse. They live in a society that is filled with anti-Black stereotypes, and sometimes they stumble into that. And, these are my friends, and I have to practice, right? I practice on my friends, right? How to have these conversations, right? I'm not trying to flame out my friend. I'm not trying to make my friend break down in tears, right? I'm trying to build a relationship. And that's the first thing that we have to understand. Who is it that we're trying to build a relationship with, right? And who is it that we're just simply trying to hold accountable, right? And that should first guide your tactics in engaging in discussions, right, around anti-Semitism. But you have to practice first. The second is this piece, who's got time, right? Everyone is busy. Most folks in this country are working 2 or 3 jobs, right, to make ends meet. I think we have to go back to traditional storytelling, right? The ways that we communicated stories to one another, right? Through film, through television, through music, right? Through poetry, right? Really tapping into culture, right? To relay our stories. So that's the second. The third is you have to support organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, right? Bend the Arc, right? There are these organizations that are taking on anti-Semitism in the Jewish community, right? And they need to be supported in that important work right now. Last thing. This is a big ask, right? It's time, and particularly for an elder population in the Jewish community, but not all, But it's time for the Jewish community to start talking about the individual acts of anti-Semitism that they have experienced as a child, right? Growing up in the South, growing up in the red-lined Northeast, right? Being the only Jew, right, in your school in Portland, Oregon, right? Until the Jewish community starts to tell the stories of anti-Semitism, not just the physical assaults that take place, right? Not just the massive terror attacks, but the day-to-day grind of anti-Semitic bigotry. There will be no movement on this issue. And that's the hardest piece, to tell a story, right, of a moment when you were probably vulnerable. But until we start telling those stories, I think folks will have a hard time understanding just how widespread anti-Semitism is.
I remember a couple years ago, this was before the pandemic, so maybe 104 years ago, you and I were on a panel, and you made this analogy that, frankly, I've stolen quite a bit.
Cool.
It was about Fashion Week. Now, just bear with me. This is going to make sense, I promise.
Settle it.
So, and I don't want to tell you, I mean, you should do this, but,
No.
but basically, is this idea of, you know, we're talking about some of the most extreme things. Violence against Jews, hatred, shootings, etc. But underneath that, right, is the normalization of the hatred that makes that happen. And so Fashion Week, if I understood it, and you correct me since you know, I mean, look at the way he's dressed versus me. I think I should take this tie off. Is sort of, you all know what happens at Fashion Week. It's like the most absurd sort of fashions. And nobody actually wears what we see in Fashion Week. It just sort of informs the type of clothing, right, that then becomes normalized that you find off the rack. That's what anti-Semitism and extremism is. That's right? At the most extreme levels, what we have to look at is not just preventing that next attack, but it's how do we prevent the normalization so that's not just off the rack, kind of a statement made by a public official, you know, a tweet that is made on our social media platform. So I don't know if I captured it exactly, but do you see how we can use that sort of Fashion Week example to make it fashionable to combat anti-Semitism and bigotry? Can we twist it?
Yeah. I mean, we have to model, right? So I sound very excited. I'm probably up here smiling, right?
Model, no pun intended.
Model, that's right. Look, we have to practice. We're in a time, I just want to come back to the beginning of this conversation. We are under major stressors right now, right? And I don't mean just in the United States, right? COVID, right? Huge swaths of economic inequality, political violence, right? That is raging across the country. The list goes on, right? Climate disasters that are happening. And it's in those stresses that we have to understand, right? That societies evolve and move forward, or they stagnate, right? The world moves forward, or it stagnates. And moving forward doesn't mean frenetic and chaotic, right? Moving forward means determined about moving everyone forward together, right? So that we have opportunity, we have safety, we have equity, we have hopes and dreams in our society. And we're disconnected, all of us are disconnected from that right now. So the way that we get back, right, the way that we create that model, that extreme model that no one's gonna wear, but it's gonna give folks a chance to practice, is really forcing ourselves. It's gonna sound so simple that no one's gonna do it because they're gonna think it's not effective, right? It's forcing yourself to stay at the table, right, with folks who fundamentally hold some of the same larger values as you do, right? And you're in total disagreement about the specifics. I think of, there's a law enforcement officer. You can imagine, I probably don't hang out with a lot of law enforcement. No one's gonna be shocked by that. But I have a really now close acquaintance, right? And it was a very similar thing, right? He and I were like out of space, and he said he was observing the crowd, and he said, you know, everyone here hates law enforcement. And I said, I don't hate law enforcement, right? That's not what I go around doing my day. And then he said, do you know any law enforcement officers? And so I said, I didn't, right? And that's the first time we saw each other. We ran into each other a little bit. But now we meet about every 2 months. And we actually just have, we actually don't talk about nice things. We actually have really hard conversations, but we're just listening to each other, right? And sitting at that table together, right? And we do it in public because people see us, right? That people see me sitting with this law enforcement officer, right? We have hard conversations. We don't try to solve those conversations. We're practicing actually sitting at a table together, right? And the practice of having a hard conversation, right, full of emotion, right, with one another is going to be super productive one day, right? It's going to help my community. And I think in the same way, all of us, right, we are in a moment, right, where the country is being defined and redefined, right, in a way that says that most of us don't belong. And the way that we push back against that is by taking on the underlying main theme of why we don't belong, anti-Semitism, right? If you've never read the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, don't go buy a copy, but you should read, right? It's the main anti-Semitic conspiracy that's being used to divide us. The way we respond is by coming back to the table. Even if we can't talk with one another, even if we're only talking about our children, because that's the only thing we can talk about, we have to be back at the table. If we're not brave enough to get back at the tables with one another, how in the hell are we going to come up with the courage to transform a society where everyone feels they belong?
Yeah, that was good. I just want to be clear, law enforcement loves me. So no, just kidding. Not really, So I think with a couple minutes left before we move on to the next speakers, and you're going to hear more about, what is, Jewish personhood? What does it mean? Who are the Jews? You're going to hear a lot more about some of this contextualizing information, which is important to the discussion from other speakers. One of the main things you and I are really here for is to talk about how all of this is really undermining our democratic institutions. And that, if you want to find any one reason to combat anti-Semitism, is that, without combating this form of hatred, your world, your community, your laws, your ability to be who you are is going to change, no matter who it is that you are. And, there's a through line between the Jews will not replace us, to shootings that we've talked about, to even the insurrection. Disinformation is the lifeblood of extremist movements. And disinformation and conspiracies are now the sort of core of what is winning people's hearts and minds. And so, maybe the last word can be on this, is it hyperbole to say that the fight against anti-Semitism is the fight for the soul of our democracy? Is that defensible statement?
Yeah, look, in 1968, segregationists understood that the idea of a separate and unequal America was no longer going to be. And racism would not allow them to accept, right, that black people had built a moral movement for change in this country that transformed the country in good ways for everyone, right? And they built a multiracial coalition. And there was, within that, I don't want to, people romanticize Black-Jewish coalition building and relationships. I don't want to over-romanticize it. But I also don't want to underplay it, right? You had two people, right? Two groupings of peoples, Jews, right? And African Americans who had experienced some parallel experiences within their histories, right? That intertwined for some of them the idea of a better world for both. And it propelled the civil rights movement in significant ways. There were tensions, like, don't believe the hype, right? We have a much more romanticized version of what those relationships were like now, right, than in 1968. They were hard. Those were hard relationships, and they didn't get a lot of support from the broader communities, right, from their communities. They were risk takers. So part of it, I think, is understanding there's a risk here. But I'm a person for over 35 years has organized in rural and urban places in America, right? National organizations, local communities, government, right? And I know one thing from having spent a lot of time watching people be harassed and terrorized by these white nationalist movements, right? And I mean victims like law enforcement, healthcare workers, educators, right? Elected officials, Native American, Black folks, gays and lesbians, right? Everyone who doesn't belong. And ultimately, right? We all know the secret to this one. Ultimately, none of us belong, right? In that society. So if you think you belong, right? You're just buying into the hype. Ultimately, none of us have a place in that society. The bedrock narrative is anti-Semitism, right? And there is such a resistance to understanding anti-Semitism in America, right? Particularly even by human rights and social justice organizations. They don't even understand the main narrative that is driving this division. So that's why anti-Semitism becomes critical for us to push forward. But there's another piece here, right? And I think, Oren, you hit on this so well, right? It is time for us to do away with conspiracy theories, right? And it is time to embrace, I'm an old punk rocker, so I'm a DIYer, right? Do it yourself, right? Sometimes even the libertarians like me when I start talking about DIY. But we get rid of conspiracies because conspiracies disempower us. They tell us there's nothing we can do to affect change in our society. And that's the power of anti-Semitism, right? It lets us off the hook by saying there's nothing we can do about these things happening in our society. And the bonus is we're going to give you someone to blame for that. And it always starts with the Jews, right? That's where the canary in the coal mine reference comes from. Anti-Semitism always starts by blaming the Jews, right? But ultimately resolves, right, with attacks and violence, not just on the Jewish community, right, but every other vulnerable or marginalized community or anyone else who's seen on the as being in the way. They become part of that conspiracy. So that's why we tackle anti-Semitism. And look, it's good practice to get us back into the room. If we can get back in the room, if we can all get back in the room on this issue, I think we can get back in the room almost on any issue in America.
So, I mean, just to conclude here, I think, if I'm taking the themes out of what we've discussed, right, is that anti-Semitism is both unique, but it's also universal, right? We have to understand the unique places that anti-Semitism comes from, but we also have to understand how it is manipulated and exploited to target a whole bunch of people in our institutions. And then, I mean, I think, Eric is always so clear about this, right? The importance of education and engagement as one of the things that we can do to push back, right? And this is why I think this conference today and what you'll be hearing throughout the day from all these other speakers and the panels is going to be so important, because hopefully it'll provide, some initial steps for those that have been doing this for a long time, or those who this is kind of your first time entering this space, ways to move forward. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is where the hope comes in. This moment in time is not going to be remembered for the Colleyvilles and the insurrections and the shootings, but it will be remembered for what good people did to push back against that hate. And I think showing up today is a really incredible start to that. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Dr. Eric Ludwig, President and CEO of Jewish Federation of Orange County.
Thank you, Eric Ward and Oren Siegel. To everyone, hello and welcome. In Deuteronomy 16:20, we are reminded, justice, justice you shall pursue. It's incredible to be here with all of you. Over 300 K-12 educators, city government officials, administrators, police, and community members seeking to create a more just world. This is the work of Jewish Federation. What I appreciate in the conversation we just heard between Eric Ward and Oren Siegel is how they have set a foundation for the deep work of today's conference. They've given us an example of dialogue and a way of being in relation with each other that allows for us to learn, to grow, and to change our thinking. They have introduced us to anti-Semitism and how it operates in political and ideological spaces. Even further, they have made visible that anti-Semitism, like racism, has a cost, a very human cost. They've asked us to think about the burden it places on our psychological well-being, our physical health, our ability to congregate and celebrate communally, and how it weakens the foundations of American democracy. The portrait they have painted of anti-Semitism in America is in some ways obvious, and in other ways difficult to fully comprehend without understanding the ways in which Jewish identity has been constructed throughout history. And while there is not one definitive Jewish identity, our next speaker will critically explore the shared elements of collective Jewish identity. He will provide a deeper understanding of how anti-Semitism is linked to Jewish personhood and internalized by Jews. It is an incredible privilege, and I am honored to introduce Ambassador Rabbi David Saperstein. In 2014, Rabbi Saperstein was confirmed by the U.S. Senate as the first ambassador at large for international religious freedom, a position that serves as principal advisor to the President and Secretary of State and the United States' chief diplomat on issues of religious freedom worldwide. He served for 40 years as the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, has headed several national religious coalitions, including the Coalition to Protect Religious Liberty, and served on the boards of numerous national organizations, including the NAACP, the National Religious Partnership on the Environment, and the World Bank's World Faiths Development Dialogue. Put simply, he is a champion of justice. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Rabbi David Saperstein.
My friends, this is a remarkable conference, and it's such an encouraging insight into the Orange County communities to see such a strong turnout on this urgent and vital issue. Indeed, considering the long history of what is often called the world's oldest hate and the devastating impact it has wrought, anti-Semitism feels for many Jews as a survival issue, no matter how thriving the community of which they are a part might be at any given moment. And this is true for many in the Jewish community in Orange County. It is true for Jews around the world. To my rabbinic colleagues who are here, let me just say it is good to be with you again, and thank you for all you do. And let me express my appreciation to the array of the Federation professionals and to Heather Klein and the many lay leaders who put together this absolutely superb program of which I am honored to be a part. I want to particularly express my appreciation to Lisa Harmony, who has contributed so much to today's success. And Lisa, I have to say, your opening remarks were fantastic. They really, really were powerful. I would love to actually steal some of it for the future. And my appreciation also to Dr. Eric Ludwig, who so brilliantly led our Zelikow School of Nonprofit Management at the Hebrew Union College, I think the best such school in America, before assuming the role of president and CEO of the Orange County Federation. Thank you for the introduction, for your leadership in our movement in the broader Jewish community, and for what you do now in this vital role. Let me see if I can just tilt this down a little bit here. I've been asked to cover a great deal in my talk and to adjust, so I'm not going to deal directly with the things that you just heard here. And what an extraordinary opportunity to have heard with Eric and with Oren here, two of the most knowledgeable, effective, and thoughtful voices in the fight against anti-Semitism. But I've been asked since there are a number of non-Jews in the room, as Eric indicated, I was asked to say a few words about the Jewish people, about who and what we are, what our fears and hopes are, how our varied identities interact with anti-Semitism that brings us together today. In particular, it is important to understand that Judaism is not just a religion, that the Jewish people are not defined just by religious identity. Perhaps the most illuminative way I can think of approaching this is to ask you to think back to the formative period of Jewish life, meaning from the time of the biblical Exodus from Egypt through the exile 1,500 years later, the majority of Jewish people from their homeland under Roman rule. Think of the surrounding nations, empires, civilizations, Egypt, Babylonia, Persia, Rome, Greece, the surrounding Canaanite nations. What were they? Were they religions? Every one of them had their own religion. Were they cultures? Each of them had their own language, literature, music, dance. Were they nations? Each one of them had a distinct national identity. Were they ethnic peoples? Each were comprised of what today we would call ethnic groups, sometimes a number of ethnic groups, but often held together by a sense and identity of peoplehood they carried with them even when they were moved beyond their national borders. The only difference between those ancient civilizations and Judaism is that they all died out. Only the Jewish people have maintained a chain of unbroken continuity of identity over the millennia. So today, there are Jews who identify mostly or entirely by their religious life, their worship, their rituals, their sacred texts. There are those Jews who may never go to synagogue, but are proud cultural Jews, interested in Jewish books, music, foods, celebrate Jewish holidays as secular Jewish celebrations. There are Jews whose Jewish identity is without ritual observance, but bound up with Jewish values, most particularly, according to the polling data, engagement with struggles for social justice and social equity. Which is, according to the polls, one of, if not the most common way that American Jewish identity is expressed. And there are many whose Judaism is their national identity, their commitment to Israel, and the central role that Israel's always played in Jewish thought, life, history. So are we a nation, a religion, a culture, an ethnicity? In truth, overwhelmingly, most Jews are a combination of those. But all of these, and perhaps more, are expressions of what it means to be a Jew, and anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hatred, speech, acts, can target any or all forms of this Jewish identity. Now, there's an intense discussion today about those engaged in fighting anti-Semitism, about what is the proper definition of anti-Semitism. Right now, 3 of those definitions have gotten a lot of attention, analysis, and debate, albeit there are other such efforts by a wide variety of academics, organizations, and experts of all kinds. But listen for a moment to the three ones that get the most attention now. And please listen for what they all have in common. The protection of Jews as Jews in any of the identities I've discussed. There's a well-accepted definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the so-called IRA definition. It says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Just to explain, by the way, the reference to non-Jewish individuals is those who an anti-Semite thinks is a Jew and engages in anti-Semitic activity against. It doesn't matter whether they're Jewish or not, it's an act of anti-Semitism. This definition calls itself, it begins by saying this is a non-legally binding definition, and it's widely accepted by hundreds of nations, localities, universities, other institutions. There is a nexus in definition, a project that began with a USC task force, but has moved to Bard University. It says, anti-Semitism consists of anti-Jewish beliefs, attitudes, actions, systemic conditions, includes negative beliefs and feelings about Jews, hostile behavior directed as Jews because they're Jews, and conditions that discriminate against Jews and significantly impede their ability to participate as equals in political, religious, cultural, economic, or social life. And there is the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism that says, a much shorter phrase, anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish. Now, why is this debate over definition important? On the one hand, an answer is, how do you fight anti-Semitism if you can't identify what it is? How does somebody know when something's anti-Semitic if you can't identify it? On the other hand, we don't hear debates over definitions of anti-black racism, of misogyny, of anti-Asian hate, of LGBTQ plus hate. We kind of accept intuitively it's a category, kind of know it when we see it. We don't get caught up in this definitional battle. Good arguments on both sides. What to keep in mind is, on any standard, there's an overwhelming consensus of what falls into the category. Think of what you saw in the remarkable video in the beginning, right? I mean, overwhelming consensus of those being acts of anti-Semitism, and they're being profoundly morally wrong and often legally criminal activity. Where they differ, these definitions, has to do a lot about Israel. And when comments about Israel and criticism of Israel can spill over a line of what's anti-Semitism. On that, there are differences. Also some differences, by the way, what I said before, and I said IRA is a non-legally binding definition. It's how it defines itself, but there have been efforts in some places to use it as a legally defined definition. And there's a big debate over whether that is a helpful thing to do or a really counterproductive thing to do by limiting what is and isn't, what has to always be a context analysis of what comprises anti-Semitism. Since Israel is such an important part, just a moment about the Jewish narrative about Israel. Paradoxically, we Jews are at once a globally cosmopolitan community, yet consider ourselves an indigenous community. For 3,800 years, from the time Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees and followed God's command to go to Israel, our destiny has been tied up with the land of Israel. For the past 3,200 years, 3,200 years, there has been a continuous, unbroken Jewish presence in that land. And even when we were victims of ethnic cleansing, as when the Babylonians took the leadership classes of the Jews to Babylon, later the Romans forced most Jews into exile from their historic homeland, the attachment to Israel remained. Wherever Jews lived, Israel and the dream to return to Israel was fully woven into the culture, the daily and holiday prayers, the rituals, ceremonies, liturgy, the language of the Jewish people. I mean, think about it for a minute. The term Judaism and Jew is derived from Judea, central part of historic Israel. Of course, today, we must, and most Jews do, recognize that the Palestinians and Bedouin communities in Israel have their own authentic claims as indigenous communities there, and that many Palestinians believe as deeply in their gut as we Jews do in ours, that they have a right to their national identity in their homeland. That requires compromise to balance out competing valid moral claims, but it does not in any way lessen or negate the legitimacy, the right of the Jewish people to their national identity in their historic homeland. This question of where the line should be drawn is a difficult one. When does criticism, even harsh criticism, even wrong criticism, when does it become anti-Semitic? Or is advocating BDS, economic pressure on Israel, when is that a legitimate use of economic pressure against policies one disagrees with? And when does it cross into anti-Semitism? Some would say any use of BDS falls into that category. Others would say no. Targeted anti-Semitism change policy is something we do all the time, all over the world. We support that. Sanctions against Iran, sanctions against Russia. Here, many Jews were involved with sanctions in the United States against states that did boycotts of states that didn't support the Martin Luther King holiday or the Equal Rights Amendment. We all use that all the time here. But when does it step over a line? When does the use of the term apartheid step over the line? If it's a warning about a direction Israel is heading to, is that the same as saying it is analogous to the apartheid state of South Africa? Because one of the forms of anti-Semitism that all the definitions agree on is comparing Jews to Nazis, comparing Israel to Nazis and to apartheid South Africa, which the idea is not the merits of the critique of the policy, but to say this is an illegitimate state, so evil, it does not have a right to exist in the form that it is. Here, that clearly steps over a line. These are complicated issues. We have to recognize that. But understanding what they are about can be really helpful, and understanding the overwhelming unanimity almost, or consensus more accurately, of the broad range of anti-Semitism, of stepping over the lines, as I indicated, whenever the legitimacy, the right of the Jewish people to their national identity and their historic homeland is denied. And then all of the other overt acts of anti-Semitism, on that there is overwhelming consensus. We know that there are historic, a word on histories of anti-Semitism here that I was told that Eric and Oren would be staying away from, and I should spend some time on it. Obviously, anti-Semitism has long historic roots in Western civilization, most notably in Christian thought and Christian history. The Christian doctrine of contempt, that is, the erroneous blaming of the Jews for Jesus' death and the intended belief that this resulted in God's cursing of the Jewish people. The belief that the covenant between God and the Jewish people ended when the new covenant with Jesus came about. The intense anti-Semitism of Martin Luther that infused certain segments of early Protestantism. All of these created a fertile field that other non-religious forms of anti-Semitism were able to flourish in them. The pseudo-scientific racialism that of the 1800s Nazi ideology was based on was actually not directly derived from Christian anti-Semitism. No Nazi ideologists really cited Christian anti-Semitism as a source for their anti-Semitism, nor did Christian leaders back Nazi anti-Semitism as in development of Christian anti-Semitism. But it created a fertile field in which the seeds of this pseudo-scientific racialism of the Nazis were able to flourish. Now, the United States offered a very different experience for Jews, in that the state-sponsored, church-sponsored, academic-sponsored anti-Semitism, so common in Christian Europe for 1,500 years before the Age of Reason, was and remains the exception in American life. America, created on Age of Reason values and theories, mostly relegated such forms of anti-Semitism to the sidelines, the fringes of American religious, governmental, and academic sectors. Yet there have been numerous expressions of anti-Semitism in American history, beginning from when Governor Peter Stuyvesant tried to limit the citizen rights of the very first Jews to land in America in New Amsterdam in 1654. Or take the mid-1800s and the Know-Nothing Party, whose anti-Catholicism, anti-immigrant, anti-Jewish worldview captured significant elements of America. And there were white Christian nationalist aspects to the KKKs that animated its racist and anti-Semitic activities during the first half of the 20th century. And of course, there is a predominantly white Christian nationalism that resonates in today's politics. Consider what they are fighting for: a romanticized notion of the past, of white privilege, of lost male domination. It is a world that no longer exists, in a world that is changing faster than ever. Consider just how fast it is changing. Some of these statistics are startling. In 2008, 54% of Americans identified as white Christians. Now, obviously, there were many whites who were not Christians and many Christians who were not white. But 54% still identified as white Christians. 2008. 11 years later, 2019, that number had dropped from 54% to 44%. 44% identify as white Christians in America. And that is frightening to many people. And as you heard before from Eric and Oren, when people are frightened by change they cannot control, they attribute it to forces that are secret, manipulating things, the conspiracy theories. They look for scapegoats, and Jews have been the quintessential scapegoats. They look for groups or theories that not just explain what's happened, but offer them the possibility somehow, as unrealistically as might be, of going back to something different. Going back to something that used to be in their imagination. Of course, in America, the other more normative strand of religious thinking ran through Roger Williams' notion of separation of church and state, Maryland's tolerant embrace of Catholics, although not so friendly to Jews in the beginning of its history, the comparative openness of Pennsylvania Quakers to minority religions, all of it feeding into the founders who shaped the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and our founding institutions. Almost all were believers in God. They created and affirmed in the Constitution's ban on a religious test for office, its guarantee of free exercise of religion for all, its ban on establishment of religion, and the intended notion of separation of church and state. They created for the first time in all of human history in America, the first time ever in history, a nation in which your rights as a citizen would not depend upon your religious identity, your religious practices, your religious beliefs. Like many of our fundamental rights, it took a while to actually get there. There were state establishments in some of the New England states going as late as into the 1830s here. But by the 1940s, the expansive Supreme Court interpretation of both of the clauses on religion in the Constitution really helped make that a reality. And it was an America that gave to Jews more rights, more freedoms, and more opportunities than we have ever known in diaspora life. And yet, we still feel by every poll a vulnerable community. And you watch that video, and the reasons become clear. Even so, into the 20th century, anti-Semitism would spill into more mainstream segments of American society. As the historian John Meacham describes, in American democracy, religious freedom had been an inestimable boon to the Jewish people, allowing us to thrive here as we have nowhere else in our history. Yet, we know a more troubling legacy, excuse me. Those are my words. This is now John Meacham's words. Here in America, where Father Charles Coughlin spewed Jew hatred on his 30s radio show with statements like, "When we get through with the Jews in America, they'll think treatment they received in Germany was nothing." Coughlin's broadcasts reached 30 million Americans a week for years. Here in America, where aviation hero Charles Lindbergh spoke at a rally of the Isolation American First Committee in 1941, he nodded at Jewish suffering in Germany and then added his take on us in America as American Jews. Their greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, our government. Let's not forget Henry Ford, whose newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, was a regular and popular platform for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, including the notorious Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this made-up conspiracy theory of Jewish control of the world. In 1938, just 1 year before the war, Adolf Hitler awarded Ford the Grand Cross of the Supreme Order of the German Eagle, the highest honor the Nazis bestowed on any foreigner. But so transformative were the political, legal, and cultural impacts of the post-World War II, post-Holocaust era that we saw, along with the expansion of freedoms and opportunities for long marginalized segments of our society, women, racial minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities in America, we saw a dramatic decrease in the percent of Americans who held anti-Semitic attitudes or who would be willing to express anti-Semitic attitudes. According to the American Jewish Committee, according to the ADL, the percentage of Jews who reported hearing recent criticism of Jews plummeted from 64% in 1946, from 64% to 16% in 1951. Wasn't that it disappeared, just cultural constraints made it inappropriate to give expression to them. And for the next 50 years, it seemed as if there were a consensus in America that you could not make it in national public life or national politics if you expressed racist or anti-Semitic attitudes. And the percent, one of the first things I did when I took over the Religious Action Center in 1976 was to hold a conference for the Conference of Presidents, the president and executive director of all the major Jewish organizations, to meet with the Democratic candidates for president that year. It was Jimmy Carter's first meeting with Jewish leaders, national Jewish leaders ever. All of them came, all 8 of them came to speak to us. To our utter surprise, George Wallace came. I have to confess, in 1976, the building was not disability accessible. We carried him up in his wheelchair into the room. He stood there, and he began by saying, "Let me begin by apologizing for some of the things I have said about Jews and about about Negroes in America. Those were his opening words. Did he mean it? That's not my point. My point was how powerful the social constraints were at that period of time. And the percent of adult Americans holding anti-Semitic attitudes declined from majority, according to the American Jewish Committee and other studies before World War II, a majority holding anti-Semitic attitudes, to the 11% holding ingrained anti-Semitic attitudes in 2020, according to the ADL. That's pretty remarkable. A number of factors: exposure to Jews in public, Jews spreading across the country into areas that had never known Jews before. Perhaps most importantly, the increasing levels of education from the end of World War II until about the year 2000, when they flattened out. Here we know that the higher the level of education, the less likely you are to hold racist, misogynist, anti-Semitic attitudes. Every one of us knows it is not an inoculation. Across economic, educational, ethnic, racial lines, anti-Semitism can be found. And today, the politicized anti-Semitism we feel on college campuses belies the. But if you look at 330 million Americans as a whole, it still remains true: the higher the level of education, the less likely we are to engage in such attitudes. Here, which says one thing, that for the 85% of the American people who go to the public school system, wherever you may send your kids, saving the public school system of America is absolutely indispensable to the future of democracy in America and combating this. But in recent years, we have seen a reversal of this. It is deeply alarming. It really is. In America, it's not just Jews who are affected. We've seen it in our own country and across the world, this explosion of anti-Semitism and the spread of hate speech and hate acts. We see acts across, again, in America against Jews, Muslims, Asians, Sikhs, gays, women, African Americans in escalating numbers. Here in California, there was a 33% increase in hate crimes in 21, a 32% rise in anti-Semitic acts. Catholic, LGBTQ+, Asians, blacks, all faced significant increases in hate crimes in California last year. In America, indeed, throughout the world, we have witnessed the degradation of civil discourse, first in the dark corners of the internet, then more publicly exacerbated by the anonymity of social media, and then the stamp of approval of such rhetoric by too many leaders in our nation. And the damage such hate crimes inflict on their victims and on America can be great and requires a national and a communal response, which is why this gathering is so important. For hate crimes are more than mere acts of violence. They are more than murders, beatings, arsons, desecrations. Hate crimes are nothing less than attacks on the values that are the pillars of our republic, the guarantors of our freedoms. They are betrayal of the promise of America. They erode our national well-being. Those who commit these crimes do so fully intending to tear at the too often frayed threads of diversity that binds us together and makes us strong. They seek to divide and conquer. They seek to tear us apart from within, pitting American against American, fomenting violence and civil discord. As Dr. King said in the wake of the Birmingham church bombing, that those 4 girls who perish have something to say to every politician who has fed his constituents with the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produces the murderer. In the end, whether in the U.S. or globally, we must confront, delegitimize, and combat anti-Semitism, recognizing the paradox that anti-Semitism is capable of taking on its own life, regardless of what happens in the rest of society, even while we recognize that unless we ensure religious freedom, safety at sites of worship and other holy sites for all peoples and all religions, an end to accepted hate speech, vigorous efforts against hate crimes against any marginalized groups, then no group in America, not Jews or anyone else, will be safe. Let me shift finally from Orange County, from America to the global scene. Eric and Ora made clear the global context of anti-Semitism crisis in the reach of the internet, the spread of social media, and taking messages of hate, disinformation, conspiracy theories, spreading them almost instantly across the globe, and how challenging and difficult it is to regulate, control, staunch such speech, extremist canards, conspiracy theories, dis and misinformation. They are never contained within a single country. Extremists in one place feed on the fears and theories of those in other places. We've seen this with so many of the terrorist acts around the world, done in the name of replacement theories that we heard about, and other forms of expression here, of expressions of hate. The result has been in the latest statistics in 2021 provided by the ADL in its Global 100 yearly study, and the invaluable work of the Cantor Center at Tel Aviv University, really one of the best in looking at global anti-Semitism, an alarming rise in anti-Semitic acts. They're fed by the intensification of the populist right taking place in the context of growing authoritarianism across the globe. It's not just in America. There are pressures on democracy. Freedom House, one of the most respected reporters on trends on democracies and authoritarianism, points out in their studies and analysis that from the end of World War II through the year 2006, with ebbs and flows every year at different places, the midpoint of human rights and democracy moved in an expansive direction. And from 2006 until today, it has moved consistently backward across the globe. How alarming. 80% of the world's population live in countries with serious restrictions to religious freedom, either from government or societal forces, growing anti-Semitism. Here we've seen it in response to the Gaza-Israel conflict in 2021. We saw it infuse the anti-vaccination movements from the U.S. to Germany, where it was particularly intense. Ironically, the Abraham Accords have spurred both new hope and new conspiracy theories about Jewish manipulation of world politics. In Pakistan and Indonesia, two countries in which I'm doing work, both against anti-Semitism and on behalf of religious freedom, in Pakistan and Indonesia, the two most populous Muslim countries in the world, both with almost no Jewish presence at all, we've seen significant and alarming growth in anti-Semitic attitudes. Remember, Europe has seen numerous anti-Semitic attacks over the past year. You know many of them. The attack on the school in Toulouse, 3 children, a teacher perished. In 2012, the attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels, 4 people perished in 2014, the Copenhagen, where a security guard perished when a bar mitzvah was attacked, the 2015 killing of 4 Jews at the Hyper Kosher supermarket, the 2020 Yom Kippur attack at the synagogue in Halle, Germany, where the shooter, not able to get in, killed 2 bystanders. Jews have been attacked on the streets of Germany and France. Increasingly, Jews are fearful of wearing kippot or other identifying clothing or symbols. That is a change here, and almost everywhere you go, there is a police presence protecting communal institutions. And that's a change from the prior World War II era. Today, almost everywhere, governments are working to help Jewish communities ensure their protections and against anti-Semitism, albeit not in every European country, but in most that is the case. The COVID epidemic, with many people staying home, saw a drop in anti-Semitic rates in 2020 compared to 19, which was a very high year. But in 2021, they've returned to the 2019 levels. And the virus has created new conspiracy theories of the Judeo virus, created by Israel, created by Jews in order to build new medicines that they would then sell to the world to their benefit. So what then do we do together to address this? There are great breakout sessions that are going to discuss this. Let me just mention just a couple of the most obvious. One, relationships are the sine qua non. Working together on common concerns, educating each other about each other, working to protect and strengthen our democracies, all are indispensable. And a time to build such relationships, to educate each other on our respective needs, our aspirations, our expectations from each other, is not in the middle of a crisis. It is like this gathering today, taking time, educating each other, cooperating, building trust and understanding. And the fundamental rule of coalitional politics, that if you want to have a friend, you must be a friend. If we want others to stand with us against anti-Semitism on behalf of Israel's security and strengthening the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel, we need to stand together with those partners on their issues on which we agree, that are vital to their well-being and central to their world values. So let me commend the Federation and its agencies for doing a great job here in Orange County in that regard. Look, what has been so extraordinary is how the religious and civic communities of America have arisen to come together after racist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic tragedies have occurred. Muslims cleaning up desecrated Jewish cemeteries in St. Louis and Philadelphia. The president of a McClellan, Texas synagogue handing a set of keys to the imam of a mosque that had been burnt to the ground for as long as they needed it. Cleaning up together graffiti and repairing the vandalism that you saw in the video earlier. The entire communities that gathered in every place that these tragedies have happened, around the Tree of Life community, the Mother Emanuel community, everywhere where we have seen such tragic victimizations. All of this working in broad-based interfaith and intergroup coalitions that are a hallmark of America. One of the encouraging things is there is more interfaith cooperation and understanding today, globally and in America, than any time in human history. What a remarkable potential contribution that can be to the success of our efforts. And we work together to delegitimize hate acts and hate speech. Indeed, when people come together like you're doing today, across political, religious, cultural lines, to build together a better America for all, they are modeling the very kind of America we hope to create. This is something that the Jewish community is deeply committed to. We ourselves are a diverse community. We're thought of as a white, wealthy community, but our rates of poverty in our own community, even with all of our generous federation, social service agencies, is not much better than the general population. And those who live vulnerably just above the poverty line, are in accord with the general population numbers here. And we are growingly diverse in our racial characteristics, more and more Jews of color, more and more Asian Jews, more and more Jews from countries around the world with different backgrounds, all coming together. We're much more diverse than people are. But that's what America is. It's not surprising that's what the American Jewish community would be. And we look to all our political, religious, cultural, and civic leaders to help in achieving it. It is in that spirit that we gather today, committed that our uniquely religiously diverse nation shall remain united, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. As Rabbi Stacy Friedman observed, it is our compassion and our common humanity that defines us. It is the way people have united as allies and partners in standing up against hatred that defines us. It is the support so many have shown one another after each attack that ultimately defines us. It is the love and tears we have shed for each other at our vigils. That is what defines us. Well, may that indeed be the goal, the outcome, the blessing of this remarkable gathering. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Deepa Bharat, Global Regional Reporter for the Associated Press.
Thank you so much for coming to this panel about manifestations of anti-Semitism today. I'm Deepa Bharat with the Associated Press's Global Religion team. Before the AP, I was a reporter with the Orange County Register for 16 years, so I see a lot of familiar, friendly faces here. So during my time at the Register, I wrote quite a bit about hate and extremism, including anti-Semitism. For the next hour, we'll be hearing from our distinguished panel about the evolving nature of anti-Semitism. And I'm certain that their powerful stories and their experiences and their insights will help us all understand how to recognize anti-Semitism regardless of where it's coming from, because that is a critical step, as our speakers earlier said, in understanding how to counter hate and effect change. So it's now my honor to introduce our panelists today. Mark Rottenberg oversees Hillel's Campus Climate Initiative, working across US with Hillel professionals and higher education leaders to ensure a campus environment in which every student can feel comfortable learning about identifying with Judaism and Israel. Mark has spent most of his professional career on university campuses, serving for many years as general counsel at the University of Minnesota and at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome. Next, we have Oren Jacobson, who is co-founder of Project Shema, which helps Jewish students, leaders, and organizations navigate the difficult conversations surrounding the Israel-Palestine and anti-Semitism, and provides social justice-centered anti-Semitism education to public and private institutions. Through his work, he has advised global Jewish institutions and served as a subject matter expert on anti-Semitism to global corporations. Welcome, Oren. April Powers is Managing Director of First Impression RX, which helps companies manage differences through training, interculturalism, and diversity. She is the co-founder of Jubian Princess, I'll let her explain that, and DEI strategist for ProjectShema.org. April is committed to building inclusion in Jewish spaces and beyond. She sits on her synagogue board and on the advisory board of Progressive Zionists of California. Welcome, April. And last but not least, we have Chuck Leek, who was actively involved with white supremacist groups for over 15 years, beginning in the mid-1980s. But after learning that a girlfriend was half Jewish, he began to question those beliefs, which was the beginning of a long disengagement process for Chuck. In 2011, Chuck was introduced to Life After Hate, and with their support began speaking publicly against his former beliefs. Today, he works as an exit specialist with Life After Hate, providing peer mentoring services to people exiting hate groups. So
sometimes it feels like monitoring.
That's true. That's true. So in this morning's plenaries, we heard about what it means to be Jewish, the different forms Jewish identity takes. We've heard about how do we define anti-Semitism. We also heard about how anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracy theories can creep into progressive spaces. We also heard about the power of storytelling, which is kind of my area, but I also see how uncomfortable storytelling makes people, and how we have to kind of sit in each other's discomfort if we are to hear stories in a truthful and sincere manner. So I'm going to kind of start here with April Powers. Can you tell us what happened to you at the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, where you were the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer? And through that experience, why do you think that Jewish people are often excluded from DEI training?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for my introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I've actually done full trainings for the city of Orange County, so I'm happy to see some of you here. True to my Jewish values, as the ambassador said, I've lived my life in progressive spaces and working towards social justice and activism, and was the head of inclusion for companies like Nestle, did similar work at Amgen, and Jubian Princess is bringing that, with my other Black Jewish partner, we bring Black Jewish experience and values into Jewish spaces, so and inclusion there. Last year, when I was the Global Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer for a large nonprofit called Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, I started my my year writing statements in support of Black lives after the George Floyd murder, and continued throughout the year with a statement in support of trans youth and their families, against anti-Asian hate. And when Jews were being beaten on the streets of New York, Paris, Los Angeles, and elsewhere for a war that was happening in Israel, when Hamas attacked Israel, basically, I started to put out a statement, and that statement had to go to the board. It needed approvals. It was a whole process. And one of the board members who quit over this particular incident said, well, we have to mention Israel. I said, we are absolutely not mentioning Israel in this statement where Jews are being beaten elsewhere, because Jew hate predates Israel in its modern form. And so we put out a statement. We had to All Lives Matter this statement, by the way, which left us open to what happened. We had to say this and all other forms of bigotry and some other things. And a woman who happened to be a new member, a Palestinian new member, who my mistake, I didn't vet her or look at anything else that she had done before, attacking other anti-Semitic statements, said, hey, I see this is for everyone. Does this include Palestinians and Muslims? And I said, absolutely. We want you here. In fact, I created new policies and procedures to make sure that Muslims in particular were taken care of at all of our events. And then she said, well, and the words twisted, well, where's the statement for Palestinians and Muslims? I don't see one. And it became sort of, she took over this statement and made it about another group, which, as my policy, I don't allow to happen. And then I said, well, hey, when we see a surge, we will absolutely post something. And then we got #FreePalestine. The whole thing was taken over, talking about slaughtering children, etc. People came for me. I was called, as a Black Jew, this was surprising, I was called a white supremacist Talmudic Jew, see you next Tuesday, or CUNT. And I should die, and so should my mother. There were death threats. The FBI got involved. It basically shut me down for 9 months. Because not only did that happen, but I know that my progressive peers that I fought for and continue to fight for did not show up for me. And moreover, did they not show up for me, they bashed me and said that I was an oppressor because I blocked her for talking about slaughtering children on a children's book website, which I also did to any Jews who said that about Palestinians, for the record. So for me, I had to change my life. My kids got phones before they should have. My alarm system changed, like everything. It was a pretty awful experience. Why is it so important for me that DEI fold anti-Semitism into their programs? For precisely what Eric Ward was talking about. It fuels all the other bigotries. And if we don't understand the oldest systemic hate that we have on the planet that we know of, we can't really effectively combat the other ones. And I think I took up enough time. But if anybody has questions, I'm here all day.
Thank you. Thank you, April, for sharing your story. I think this is the point of this panel, is to hear these real stories so you get concrete examples of how anti-Semitism manifests itself. On that note, I'm just going to move over to Oren Jacobson here. So how did anti-Israel expressions get swept up in American social justice movements? I know that's what you focus on, so I'm going to get straight to that. Yeah, very easy question.
So when Donald Trump was elected president, those of us who've spent our life in progressive movements in particular were reasonably stunned. It's a fair statement. And one of the big questions that we were all asking ourselves was, how do you go from Barack Obama to Donald Trump? And so you're sort of looking for an explanation to make sense of the world, right? We're telling stories, as Eric said, to make sense of the world. And if you think about the progressive movement of 2012 with Obama in the White House, and really up until the moment that Donald Trump got elected, there was sort of an optimism of where this country was going, right? Lincoln freed the slaves, Martin Luther King and civil rights, and now we've got a black man in the White House, like we're on the ascendancy, right? And as a way to sort of explain this backlash and this response to the black man in the White House, a lot of the dialogue inside of our spaces began to center on these big systemic issues, social constructs, white supremacy, colonialism, patriarchy, and to another extent, capitalism as well. One of the things that's happened over history for Jews is that the greatest sins of society have always been placed onto Jews. So when the issue was the crucifixion of Jesus, the Jews were the Christ killers. In communist nations, Jews are the capitalists undermining the people. In capitalist nations, Jews are the communists undermining the people. In Nazi Germany, with their pseudo-race science, we were the impure race undermining the white race, the pure-blooded Aryan race. And so what's ended up happening over the last few years is that Israel has become sort of a poster child in these conversations for really the worst sins of the modern Western world, right? And so Israel becomes sort of a white supremacist, settler colonial, patriarchal society, and the way to understand Israel is to understand America. And so, you know, there's plenty of easy snapshots of things happening in the world that make that story actually pretty easy to digest, especially if your critique of the world is what I just mentioned, sort of that framework of these systems of power and oppression. And like April, I spend all of my time doing progressive organizing work, not as well as Eric, I don't think, but decently well. Criminal justice reform, I help lead an organization focused on bringing more men into the fight to protect and expand reproductive rights in America. We operate in multiple states, and so most of my organizing work is actually not around anti-Semitism or Israel, it's around these causes. And so if you are critiquing our society in ways that I think are fair to explain the systemic inequities of our society, and then you look across an ocean, it's not that hard to see similar things. The challenge, though, is that the entire world isn't America, and the entire world isn't the Western world, and you know, the cleavages in Israel, or the cleavages in the Middle East, or the cleavages in Asia are not the same exact cleavages across societies that exist here. But when you sort of overlap that lens onto the conversation and you start to look across at what you perceive as a white religious community oppressing a community, an indigenous community of color, it becomes really easy to say, if I understand this place, meaning America, I can understand Israel. And so that allows more space for ideas that have been out there for a long, long time to take root and become more normalized inside of the space. And has been said by others, right, when an idea isn't challenged, you know, if I don't push back on an Islamophobic comment, if I don't push back on a sexist comment, it becomes normalized in the group that I'm in. And so that's part of what's happened. And I will say this, because most people don't know what it means to be a Jew, and because most people don't actually know what anti-Semitism is, and because most people don't know how anti-Semitism works, most people in these spaces that I'm in don't even notice or recognize when things actually are a problem, which isn't to say that criticism of policies of the Israeli government is a problem. It's to say that sometimes other things happen, but most of my peers don't notice it, which then allows it to become normalized and become more part of the discourse.
Thank you. Now, all of those tensions almost often boil over to the campus, to the college campus and high school campuses, and that's where Mark comes in here. Now, we know that the Israel-Palestine issue has caused significant tensions on college campuses, but it's kind of like a two-sided issue with anti-Semitism, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you have the BDS movement and everything that's associated with that, and then on the other hand, you have white nationalist groups, sending out their propaganda into college campuses through flyers and so on. So can you talk about these two different manifestations of anti-Semitism on campuses?
Thank you, Deba. So I come to this work as a former chief legal officer of two very large research universities. And up until 3-4 years ago, I was not involved in the Jewish professional space. But as has been said several times here this morning, universities have become an epicenter for this problem. And so I decided to switch roles and become a unicorn, which is what the CEO of Hillel International called me. He wanted somebody who could translate into higher ed spaces, what the Jewish community now perceives to be a very, very central priority. Hill is operating on over 550 campuses across the world. We have 5 campuses in the Ukraine, which I didn't even know until 6 months ago. And this has become really, as I said, an epicenter of concern for the thousands of Hill professionals that operate on, as I said, over 550 campuses around the world. The conflict on the left is something that I'll spend a minute on, but let me just reference first the attacks on Jewish students coming from the right. We've seen already and discussed already here this morning the stereotyping of Jews as money grubbers, as people who control the media, the economy of their country, and so forth, and the government. For most Jewish students, not all, for most Jewish students who are, after all, on their campus principally not to be spear throwers on anti-Semitism, right? They're there to get their engineering degree or their fine arts degree or to join clubs and sororities and fraternities and so on. These kinds of attacks strike many of our students as being crazy because they are so disembodied from their own young lives, most of them. And so when there's a swastika in the snow at Cornell, or when there's an outrageous incident at a public university dining hall or on social media from the right, many of these students simply dismiss that as being nuts, crazy, outrageous, and they are able to assimilate that into their lives and proceed. On the left, however, while it is by far less violent than the attacks from the right, there is a deeper wound and problem for many Jewish students on our campuses because overwhelmingly our community, as Rabbi Saperstein has noted and others, our community identifies with progressive movements in this country for many, many decades. And for Jewish students who overwhelmingly come from homes where progressive values are imbued in them, an attack by their roommate as being a white racist or a colonial imposter in an indigenous part of the world strikes them much more deeply. And the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, and sanction movement, affects our Jewish students in a much deeper way because it represents a conflict for them between their Jewish identities, and we have to make this a plural, right? As Rabbi Saperstein and others have already noted, Jews in this country are a very diverse group, and Jewish students are an even more diverse group. There are more Jewish students of color than there are Jews as a percentage in America as a whole. The younger people in our community are more diverse than the older people in our community. These conflicts and these attacks strike them in a much deeper way because let's remember something, folks. Internally to Jewish history, internally to Jewish culture, our liturgy, our holy texts, our songs, there is no identification of Jews as white. You will never find in the Talmud a discussion of Jewish whiteness, right? There are no Jewish poems and prayers and stories about Jewish whiteness. Identifying a 19-year-old engineering student as a white Jew may be appropriate in the context of America today, but it has no indigenous, and I use that term very deliberately, it has no indigenous meaning in Jewish history. Right? And we don't need to talk about all the different ways in which Jews were identified as not white, as Oren mentioned a minute ago. So that's a very brief headline description of what many Jewish, not all, and not on all campuses, but what many Jewish students are facing from the right and from the left.
Thank you so much. And Chuck, I have to tell you, one of the least favorite of my assignments as someone covering hate and extremism was to go to a white supremacist website and look up their propaganda about Jewish people. Now, you were ingrained in those movements for a while. What are some of your thoughts on how you actually got drawn into that propaganda and how you got out of it?
It's kind of a long and involved story, but so to sum it up, generally what I'd say is that it was trauma that got me involved in the movement, and it was trauma that pulled me out. It doesn't, I mean, I'm not trying to like excuse the choices I made and trying to pass it off as, you know, an effect of something that happened to me, but the things that happened to me in childhood kind of set the stage that allowed me to, you know, adopt things that I absolutely disagree with now. And also part of that was there was a pretty deep culture in the time that I was growing up in the, you know, I grew up in LA, I was born and raised in LA, I have deep ties to Orange County. My grandparents lived here until they died, and I spent summers here every year growing up. And in LA and Orange County in the 70s and 80s when I grew up, there was a really deep undercurrent of white supremacy. It was prevalent everywhere in the schools I went to. You know, kids would draw swastikas or SS bolts or SWP on their folders. And it was desensitizing. You get desensitized to the symbology. And so, you know, I was dealing with, you know, traumatic issues that, or I'm not dealing with them actually, but things that caused a deep well of self-hatred that I then, you know, as I moved into my late teens and early adulthood, kind of unleashed on the world because I didn't understand where I was inside myself. And then, so I was looking for easy answers to like the real, like, deep struggles I had within myself that I couldn't cope with, didn't understand, couldn't like comprehend. And to, you know, I joined the military, and then I got connected with skinheads and like started getting direct propaganda through music and through, you know, stuff that we were sharing amongst each other in the way of zines and things like that. And so the early desensitization and the trauma, and then to find a group of people that had like as their stated goal, like, you know, brotherhood and love for their race and so forth and so on, and all the nonsense they spout, it gave me like a sense of purpose and like belonging, and which was something I really didn't have at the time. And then, you know, so there's like a deep undercurrent of anti-Semitism in this movement, and it makes a real easy target to point all of these issues that I had that I didn't know how to deal with at an external group, and make that external group like the reason for the problems that I had, you know, like whatever the you know, trouble I got into, you know, with law enforcement, you know, like economic problems I had, all of those things were easy to blame on the Jews because they controlled everything. You know, they were this overarching force that was trying to, like, you know, destroy my life personally. And then that whole, like, so a lot of people don't understand about like the white supremacist movement in the United States. They look at it as deeply anti-black, which it is, but I mean, from my personal experience of it, the real underpinning of it is anti-Semitism, and that they use anti-Semitism as the point that everything else revolves around, as far as like how white people are being, you know, disenfranchised, and where the integration is coming from, where immigration is coming from, and the point of that being the destruction of European people. All of that hinges and circulates around anti-Semitism as the main point that gives entry to all the rest of it, I guess. And so when I was involved, from the KKK people to the outright neo-Nazis, anti-Semitism was really the linchpin to everything. Anyway, so
Thank
I
you.
hope that answered the question.
Yes, you did. Thank you. April, it's really complicated being African American, being a Black Jewish woman at that, and leading a DEI program the way you do. I'm sure that is wrought with a lot of challenges for you personally and professionally. But can you talk about why Jewish people are often excluded from DEI training, and what are some of the consequences of such exclusion?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. Yeah, it's fun being me, let me tell you. I can be discriminated in like 15 different ways, just you watch. And on top of it, my nieces and nephews are LGBTQ+, Jutinos. We've got the whole basket, and some neuroatypicality mixed in. So repeat the beginning of the question. I've got the end of the question.
Oh, of course. Why do you think Jewish people are excluded from DEI
Thank you.
training?
Jewish people are excluded because when you think Jew, you do not think of somebody who looks like me. In our minds, in the United States of America, we consider Jews to be a white religious community. And I do a lot of work with Project Shema and Oren, who has a great framework for this. And if you go to his session, you'll learn more later. But if you think of Jews as a white religious privileged community, which is unique in our thousands of years of history, we have never had it this good, right? Like, this is not the norm. It is an exception to the rule, and it doesn't mean, as was mentioned, we still have the same poverty levels, similar socioeconomic disparities as the general population, and the fact that we even have that, we think of that as amazing, okay? Because civil rights for Jews is a very modern phenomenon, like only maybe a couple hundred years old. So the Jews are left out because of that perception. We don't realize that there are a lot of Jews that look like me in the U.S., and outside the U.S., more than 50% of the population we would consider Jews of color or multi-ethnic Jews or Jews of other, based on our own definitions. So there's no sense of urgency, right? They're white, they're privileged, why are we dealing with this? And when you go to the framework of, no, in fact, we've never been considered white, and if you're a Jew who considers yourself white, I invite you to check the other box, starting as soon as you're comfortable doing so that we get counted properly. At the end of the day, is the KKK and the neo-Nazis, once they take over, are we gonna be put in the white box?
Yeah, I think it was Dr. Ward said something earlier about, if you think they're not coming for you, you're wrong. No, you don't get to check the white box.
You don't get to use a sword and a shield, right?
Yeah, right.
You don't get to be white and stay safe here, and then later on have it be used against you. So no, we are not, and we're not considered white by a number of groups, and anti-Semitism is on the rise. I was one of thousands of incidents last year, and the highest year of anti-Semitism since it's been recorded since the 70s, right? So we know that it fuels other hate. We know, I won't repeat what everyone else has said. So if we can understand how the tropes, just the conspiracy theories fuel other types of hate and bigotry, then that helps combat other types of hate at the same time. I don't think we need to have anti-Semitism be the be-all and end-all in a DEI program, but I think we should fold it into the toolkit, certainly. And if you want to hear that talk, why you should fold it into your toolkit, if you go on my LinkedIn, you'll see a link to register for tomorrow's talk if you haven't had enough. Tomorrow's talk at 1:30, it's free, and you can see why it should be folded in to the toolkit. Additionally, I want to say one other thing for K through 12 schools. Just like we're trying to get Black boy joy and Black girl joy into the books and normalize some of these books, please include Jewish girl and Jewish boy and Jewish person joy, because if we are tokenized and everything is about us being a sad story and only Anne Frank, which please keep including that, we don't want the Holocaust denial, but Jewish children and all kids who are marginalized or othered need to see themselves having a normal life in books. So that's my, as someone who worked in that industry.
Oren, help us understand this phrase, Zionism is racism. What does it mean to those who say it in progressive and social justice circles?
So before I answer that, I just want to add one more thing to what April said, which is, as the ambassador spoke, right, about the complexity and nuance of Jewish identity, if you exclude anti-Semitism education from your DEI work, you're going to end up pushing forward a misunderstanding of Jewish identity. And if you end up pushing forward a misunderstanding of Jewish identity, you're also going to end up pushing forward a misunderstanding of anti-Semitism, which means that most people won't actually see the anti-Semitism when it's in front of them, which means you can't stop anti-Semitism. So I just want to underscore that with what April said.
I'm going to add one more thing too. If you are running a DEI program and you only have Jews as a religious community or group, then I invite you to also change that and make them an ethnic ERG, because that is where most of us sit. Most of us don't always see ourselves in Judaism. There are Jubus, Buddhist Jews, and atheists and everything.
Yeah.
So they should be on the religious council or the interfaith councils, but not always just seated in the religious group. Thank you.
Yes. So it says Zionism is racism. Can't really answer that question without trying in some short way to define Zionism. And let me say that there are many Zionisms, right? Just as there are many forms of Jewish identity, there are many thoughts and schools of thoughts on Zionism. But for the average Jewish person, when we hear the word Zionism, what we think about is a movement for Jewish liberation and national self-determination in some portion of our ancestral homeland. Now, that being said, many Jews don't actually have a definition themselves of what Zionism is, but when we hear that word, that's usually what it means to the vast majority of Jews across the world. The idea that the Jews have a right to and a need for a state in some portion of our ancestral homeland. For Palestinians, the impact of Zionism is obviously very different, right? We've probably all heard of the term the Nakba. And if you think about what Jews would call the War of Independence, the flip side of that coin is the Nakba, right? An act of displacement. And so for Palestinians, the impact of the success of Zionism, the establishment of a Jewish state on a portion of our ancestral homeland, obviously is experienced very, very differently. When you're thinking about the framing or the word Zionism as racism, right? The power in those three words together is that it actually tells a story. And in that story, essentially, the only reason that a Jewish person, in particular, could support the existence or continuation of a Jewish state, this Jewish state, is because that person is inherently racist. Right? Zionism is racism, Zionists are racists. That the only reason that you could arrive at the conclusion that the Jewish people have a right to a state, and a state in this place, and the continuation of that state is that you're racist. Meaning that if I say Israel has the right to exist, I'm essentially in some ways complicit in the harm that the Israeli government may be inflicting onto the Palestinian people with whatever policy we want to criticize. The challenge with that, or the problem with that, is that it's a very dehumanizing framework, right? Inherently, we don't want racists around us, right? The racists aren't okay in our clubs. The white supremacists and the KKK need to stay at the fringes of our society. So what you're essentially saying when you say Zionism is racism or Zionists are racism, let me take this back. What we hear, because I think a lot of people actually use that framework without exactly knowing what Zionism is or what they're explicitly saying. But what Jews hear is that the 80 or 90% of us who believe in the legitimacy and need for a Jewish state on some portion of our homeland are irredeemable. That we are akin to white supremacists, KKK, neo-Nazis, white nationalists. So for us, that obviously strikes a whole bunch of fear because you're basically saying almost all of us are bad people. That's like the simple framework that we interpret that language as. And again, I never ascribe intent to who is using a framework. I have no idea what's in someone's heart or mind. And like I said, when people ask me if I'm a Zionist, my question back to them is, well, what is a Zionist? Because in most cases, they don't actually know what a Zionist is or what an anti-Zionist is. So you have to spend some time, to Eric's point, exploring what is our interpretation of one single word. And let's be honest, no one word can describe any one person, right? So the story then is that Jews are racist, or the reason that Jews continue to support quote-unquote Israel, which implies that we oppose the Palestinian people or a Palestinian movement for statehood, is that we're racist. And that's dehumanizing, and that creates fear because we've been dehumanized a whole bunch in our past, and that almost has never led anywhere good for us, right? There's a different story that I think needs to be understood, not as a way of challenging the narrative and concerns and the lived realities of the Palestinian people, but better understanding us. The ambassador talked about the almost 4,000-year connection for Jews to this land. And the 3,200 years, I think was your exact number, I was paying attention, to the continuous presence of Jews in this land. And so some people think about the word indigeneity and they think, where are you from? Other people hear indigeneity and they think, how long have you been there? And so from the framework of where are you from, the archaeological record is pretty straightforward on where Jews emanate from. And since Jews were forcibly removed from this land, violently removed and sent into diaspora in what we would call today an act of colonization, Jews have had at the center of our culture the idea of returning to Jerusalem, to Zion. So if you want to know where Zionism comes from, it's Zion is another word for Jerusalem. So while Zionism as a movement for a nation state, in a world full of nation states, emerges in the 19th century, it has been part of our cultural DNA for 2,000 years since we were forcibly removed and sent into diaspora. And then think about what happened to Jews when we were in diaspora. We all know about the Holocaust. It's a very famous story, what happened to us in Europe when we presented as white. There is a very large Persian community here in California. And if you've never had a chance to talk to a Jew from Iran about their experiences being a brown-presenting Persian Jew from Iran, you should. If you've never talked to an Ethiopian Jew, or an Iraqi Jew, or a Yemeni Jew, or a Syrian Jew, you should. An Egyptian Jew. What's that?
Igbo from...
Yeah. And the reality is that while the life for the Jewish people in Europe was distinctly different in terms of the mass discrimination and violence than in any other part of the world, where Jews presented as black in North Africa, Jews were systemically discriminated against and faced violence for being Jews, forcibly driven out of the land. Where Jews presented as brown or longstanding parts of the population in Southeast Asia and Middle East, we were just Jews, and we were discriminated against for being Jews, and where Jews were presented as white in Europe, we were discriminated against and violently targeted for being Jews. So imagine now, in the aftermath of the Holocaust and that long story of attacks for centuries and centuries and centuries, after 2 in every 3 members of the Jewish people on a continent were murdered, and alongside it, societies in the Middle East, where there was almost 1 million of us spread out, said, we don't want you here either. Everybody then floods to this new state. And in the aftermath of that new state, a war breaks out, and then another war. And then when it becomes clear that you're not going to beat Israel on the battlefield, the tactics change, and they turn to acts of terror. And now you've got forces that have nothing to do with the Palestinian people, like Hezbollah or Iran, chanting death to Jews. And for 74 years, those people have lived in that little plot of land that's the size of New Jersey, surrounded by people who have not been too terribly happy, for some reasons understandable and for others deeply problematic, that the state exists, and you've lived under a constant state of violence. Now, if that's your story, if that's who you are, I would potentially say that your connection to the land is both deep and historically part of your cultural DNA. And I would say that wanting and believing and thinking that Jews need a state is a natural response to intergenerational trauma and fear. And as we sit here in this country watching democracy under attack, and conspiracies spread, and white nationalism come out from underneath the hood, and we hear folks on the right saying things like Jews will not replace us. And by the way, if you go onto right-wing blogs, you're going to find lots of attacks on Zionists in those spaces too. And then at the same time, you see this rising rhetoric around you saying that you're a racist just because you think Israel has the right to exist, even if I oppose every policy of the Israeli government. You would be afraid, or at least you'd be concerned. And so I think it's important to hear the stories of the Palestinian people and hold them in one hand. There are some people, though, who are saying to you, you should not listen to the stories of Jews. And what I am suggesting to you is that the truly just, progressive approach to this is to try to hold both of those stories together at once and not allow anybody to dehumanize either the Palestinian people or the Jews.
Thank you. Now, both of you, April and Oren, you spoke about the Jewish identity and how it cannot be just reduced to a faith. And, you know, you got to look at the broader cultural, ethnic, historical identity, as you just eloquently mentioned. Mark, how has that identity not been recognized on college campuses? And how has that changed the climate on campus over the last decade or so?
So, as both April and Oren have said, the nature of Jewish identity, and especially for young people, has a diverse quality to it that is very frequently, not always, but very frequently not recognized by higher education administrators or structures. And that includes, especially as April was referencing, the DEI programs that proliferate by the thousands across American higher education today. Oren described in a very beautiful and eloquent way, in a little 5-minute encapsulation, how many Jewish people understand their history of marginalization and expulsions across hundreds of locations around the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, and in the Americas. But as I mentioned before, for most young people attending college, they're there to get an education. They're there for socialization. They're there for professional growth and to find the qualifications that will get them a job. And in those spaces where our Jewish students want to belong, and that includes, as I referenced before, in socially progressive and social justice groups, the epithet of Zionism, that you're a Zionist, as Oren was saying, is hurled around at these young people as the kind of epithet that Oren mentioned, right? And it's actually much simpler than the story that Oren referenced. It's simply an epithet. It's like calling these young people kikes or other highly derogatory terms that were popular in ages past. The vast majority, and I say this as someone who's lived in a higher education space and worked professionally since I was 18 and went to college. I never actually left. I've been in the C-suites of big universities for a very long time. Most of these people don't know what they mean when they call a kid a Zionist. And most of these people, young people who say, you know, you can't march in a protest against gender violence, against sexual assault, for women or other gendered identified individuals if you're not willing to condemn Zionism. For most of the people who make that claim, they have no idea. They've never listened to Oren or anyone else for that matter talk about how the word Zionism is internalized within the Jewish community and how it's been virtually completely appropriated by people who are hostile to that idea. And so a 20-year-old or a 22-year-old who's just there to get an education and to feel part of a community of students and scholars, many of them wishing to be part of a progressive group, to be called a Zionist is simply to be insulted without reference to the story that Oren referenced. And this lands in particular, as I mentioned before, in an environment in which diverse identities is the name of the game, right? Very few Jewish students identify only and exclusively as Jews. They have a gender identity. They have a geographic identity. My wife are Cuban Jews, and her family are from Cuba, right? There's a geographic component often to their identities. There's an ethnic and racial and religious and cultural identity. And so to reduce them to being a Zionist and therefore a racist, right, is a gross distortion. And our higher ed institutions need to own that issue. Just as black folks didn't go to Ole Miss simply because 18 and 19-year-old black students decided to go there, just as women on college campuses who were subjected routinely to sexual violence and assault didn't suddenly solve that problem on their own, the administrations of our universities, I say this because we're in this venue, right? And there are going to be some 50 people who are going to be in our breakout, I hope, to talk about this in greater detail. Our institutions need to accept responsibility for this kind of marginalization and bullying and exclusion.
Thank you. I believe we've run right out of time, but I'm just going to quickly ask Chuck for a question about how, what were some of the things that helped you change your mind about anti-Semitism? I'm sure compassion was a big part of that, but if you could just address that really quick.
Sure, yeah. Compassion is something that pretty universally is recognized across all of the people that call us formers, call us whatever you want. But almost universally, the story hinges around somebody who was categorized as the other, who showed the person compassion. In my case in particular, I was going through a bunch of rough stuff and had stepped away from the groups that I was involved with, but still hadn't changed my mind. And I was dating a girl for about a year, and she was sitting there in a conversation with me one day, and we were like, I don't know, it was tense, but not an argument. And she said, well, I'm half Jewish, knowing full well that I was a, neo-Nazi skinhead, basically. And I sat there for, at least a minute, kind of shocked and stunned, and had this realization that I cared more about this person, loved her more than I cared about all of the things I had been espousing for, nearly 20 years at the point that this happened. So yeah, compassion, kindness, if you can show somebody who is involved in this stuff that on a personal level, it may be the thing that changed their mind,
It's nice to end on that positive note, isn't it? Well, thank you very much, all our panelists, for your deep insights. We all learned a lot. Thank you so much.